And so we'll begin just by asking you, Pastor Archie, how did you discern the call into pastoral ministry?
Well, coming from a very, very dysfunctional model of the church in the urban core, I didn't have a lot of confidence in the impact of the church and what the church could do. But God began to grow and I was working in a corporate environment, and God began to grow in my appreciation of His Word and the utilization of His Word in the corporate environment in which I worked. And as a corporate executive, I could take God's tools and put them to work. It started really with a frustration in my heart, recognizing that I was utilizing these tools and seeing success in the corporate environment, yet the church was suffering quite a bit. And I really thought I would be a great giver to the church, or I would contribute my consulting work and things of that nature to the church. I really didn't expect that I would be in pastoral ministry. But over a period of time, God began to press heavy on my heart and two other guys that I was working with to try to impact the church in the urban core. I think that, and I'm telling God, okay, you need to give me another sign because I don't see myself as a pastor. And then I had a meeting with a friend of mine that I had started doing a little work with. You guys might be familiar with the Urban Alternative. And so I was at Dallas in a hotel room, and I'm sitting talking to Dr. Evans, who is the president of the Urban Alternative, and he said, "You know what God's telling you, right?" And I said, "No, what?" And he says, "God is calling you to bring about that vision that He's given you." And I said, "Yeah, but I'm not the pastor kind of guy." He said, "Look, you can do it or not do it, but at some point, you're gonna have to choose, Nineveh or Tarsus. You have to make that decision." Of course, that wakes you up a little bit. And when I went back and shared it with the other guys, they said, "We've been seeing this for a while," and God just continued to give the confirmations, and until I became pretty convicted, and it became well with my soul. That was kind of my theme song at that point in my life.
Yeah. Well, now, so did you, when you went into pastoral ministry, did you go into a church that was already existing, or did you plant a church?
No, I was working with the church, a pastor who was one of the kind of the sending church, my pastor, and finishing up school, we just really felt like God wanted us. The model that we were thinking about was so different that we thought that trying to change the stream of the traditional urban church in the area that we felt like God was calling us to minister would have probably taken quite a bit of time. So we felt like God wanted us to create a model that reflected the vision that we were looking at.
Sure. Can you tell us a little bit about that model?
We expected that the church should be a biblical alternative for living in every area of life.
Okay.
And that means that every area then we need to tackle. And we need to create a model. One of the first things we recognized, we moved into an area where there was prostitution. Prostitution was in the front of our building. There were no street lights. The city services had compromised. There were drug dealers. There was 9 drug houses on the 2 blocks behind us. There was a plasma center where people got money, gave plasma to get money to buy drugs, and so it was just as dysfunctional as it could be. And the institutions were closed off, and there were probably about, I think we calculated about 60,000 residents and about 10,000 job opportunities. And so we felt like it was our responsibility to come in. How could we tell these people to live biblically? And the opportunity to live biblically was not there. So we felt like God wanted to bring that to bear. So we kind of saw our community as our mission field. And we've seen God's blessings over the years. Now we have street lights and new bus. The prostitutes are, for the most part, gone. The plasma center is now our drop-in center for drug rehab. The drug houses are not on the block anymore. We've just seen God work. We have close to 50,000 jobs now in that particular area. So we've just seen God do some amazing things. But we saw that as part of the vision of the church, not just to have people meeting in a huddle every week.
Sure. When you talk about growing up and seeing dysfunctional dysfunctional sorts of church when you were growing up. Did you grow up in an urban church like that?
I grew up in an urban church that was very dysfunctional, and I was part of the dysfunctionalism, actually.
Yeah.
I used to.
That's the way that works, I think. Yeah.
I was, I mean, my first job was at about 9 years old. I was a carrier for street pharmaceuticals, and that's drug dealing for those who don't know.
Chemists.
And I was a chemist. And then I got promoted through that system into where I really ran several drug outlets in the city. And one of the sponsor for most of my liquor was a deacon who owned a liquor store, and a lot of my customers I met through the church. Wow. So, and that was normal for me. It was like all I saw. So.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to just ask you. A lot of our students are curious about, and they love to think about different sociological trends, cultural trends that will be impacting how people do pastoral ministry in the future, what the church will look like in the future. Are there any sort of major trends that you're seeing now that you'd say, this is something to look out for? This is something that I think is on the horizon that may impact how you do pastoral ministry in the future?
I would say that right now, one of the reasons why I'm on the State Board of Education and we do a lot of stuff in the world of education is because what I think we don't realize, and in my opinion, it is the greatest threat of tomorrow's church is illiteracy. People who cannot academically assess some of the basic core values of life are not going to be able to effectively apply. I mean, if you really thought about the church and said, let's take everything out that requires literacy, then all of a sudden nobody's doing devotions anymore, nobody can be taught anymore. You begin to tear the church apart. The sword that God has given us is the Word of God. I mean, basically, if we have illiterate congregation, you just cut the hands off and told the people to use the sword. And so that's a bigger threat than false doctrine, Mormonism, Scientology, even Oprah's new thing she's making up. All of this stuff is not near as much a threat as what tomorrow's congregation will look like. And across the city, especially in urban areas, then we think that if we get a few churches, you may have maybe 1,000 kids, maybe 1,500 kids in the city that go to Christian schools out of 60,000 children. And so, so if you just say parochial schools is the answer, then we've missed it. One of the values in our country is that we offer people a fair education. And I think that if we're not fighting for that as a church, and most of the time urban churches are because we feel the pain a lot faster, suburban churches think that's not an issue. And so I think that future is going to determine the effectiveness of the church movement overall.
Speaking of how suburban churches don't a lot of times perceive that need, are there any things that you know about that suburban churches are doing that can help out? I mean, in terms of advocacy, in terms of lobbying, any models that you know of that might help some of our students?
Some of the things that we're working on is, I'll give you an example. We're partnering with a college, UMKC, college around there, and a lot of the folks who believe in some of the things that we're doing. There is a urban apartment complex. Well, we've got an agreement with the apartment complex to allow a number of students to stay in two of those apartments as dorms, and they would offer after-school tutorial services to the kids that are there. Wow. And so now you're building a discipleship-based relationship. You're fixing the deficiency. You're connecting urban and suburban people there by them living in that area and while they're going to school there. And then at the same time, you are feeding that right information back to the suburban churches that we're working with. And so you have a connection that's there. But I think recognizing that what I contribute will equip somebody to be a good believer, even if I'm not teaching them theology. I think that's the thing that some suburban churches have recognized. Right now, we're working on a partnership to offer services to kids where we go in and actually serve as a mentor connection with a number of kids. So we'll take a suburbanite, as we call them, and bring them to the hood and give them 5 kids. And so the suburbanite is working with a urbanite, and the urbanite will make sure that the urban kids, understand how to function in a disciplinary way. One of the problems we run into is, black kids from the hood, they know when you are too polite to address their issue. And so when you say, y'all be quiet and sit down, be quiet now, I have the lesson now, the black sister going to say, listen, shut up and sit down. So the kids going to say, okay. and give permission to begin to move on that piece. I mean, those are some things that we're doing to really help handle the diversity, but offer a solid program of development.
Oh, that's great. Okay, now let's head back to our 5 questions. I'm sorry I got us off target for a little bit, but let's talk about a little more personally. As you look back over the last years in ministry, could you tell us about maybe what you would see as the high point? Maybe there's a couple of them. And then the one, if you feel comfortable, whatever you feel comfortable sharing, maybe the low points and a couple of low points in pastoral ministry for you.
I would say the high points is really seeing folks that you've supported and loved and cared for grow into folks who are spreading the word themselves. For us to see, some of the folks, I remember the skepticism that some folks have about you see them grow up. We have a youth impact service that, about 600-700 kids come in every first Saturday, and it's like rap and poetry, and it's kind of like Saturday Night Live, but with a sermon. I started with these folks, and they were like, well, we can't do this, and I'm working with them to put together the structure, and now I just show up to preach. But to see them actually manage the whole thing and run the whole thing, and their passion for Christ and all of that kind of stuff, those are high points in the sermon. And then my kids, of course, seeing my kids love the Lord is a high point, because it proves that we offered a genuine picture of the church. Low points, I would probably say the lowest point have been for us, we had a team, some folks that we have worked with, a couple really, that we worked with for a lot of years, trained them, put them in positions, cared for them. I remember the kitchen caught a fire. We just went and got their kids, come over our house. Just everything that you could do to love and care for some folks. And then found out, really through a process that led to their church discipline, that they were just crooked. They were selfish and crooked and really wasn't out for our best good. And so that was kind of hurtful with everything that took place as a result of that. And so I think that was probably the low point, is when you have people that you've trusted and you've given your life to, and then you find out that the genuine expectation in return that you're not getting it. And then the people who they persuade, who you've served and loved, they become folks that that really, you find out, are wolves in sheep's clothing. Matter of fact, I think Watson was there when we were beginning in the middle of that. He might not know what was going on, but we had a church discipline situation. It was just a lot of stuff that was happening during that. So it was hurtful to have to discipline in that situation.
Okay, thanks for that. There are themes I think we'll probably see over the years as we do those sorts of themes. Disappointments with other people. Who are your heroes in pastoral ministry?
We'll probably have to say there's a gentleman named who's kind of been a father in the ministry to me in many different ways. He's been one of the pillars of pastoring in the city. But he's always seen his church as a church that would bring change to the city, an alternative, a biblical alternative, so it wasn't just in the box of the 4 walls, it was ministry. His name is Charles Briscoe, great guy, retired, and serves on some boards where I'm president now, so we get to hang out quite a bit. And then Tony Evans have been a real supporter of mine. He and his wife have supported me and my wife for a lot of years, and so their connections have been there. The other pillar I would say is not a guy who's in the ministry. It's a Christian guy who's in business, very, very successful business guy. And he asked me to hold him spiritually accountable. And then over time, I said, you need to hold me practically accountable. And so he and I have had that relationship where I can go in and say, well, Frank, his name is Frank Ellis, that ain't right. And Frank will come in and say, no, you need to, Frank will demand that I do this, 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 and this, and then I report back to him. So that relationship has been a blessing. But he's not in the pastorate, but he is key to me being successful as a pastor.
Yeah. So when you say practically, he holds you practically accountable.
Yeah, organizational structure.
Organizational structure.
Yeah, are we doing, like he'll ask me questions, like he'll say stuff like, okay, so God gave you 2 hours with 100 people for a year. So show me the progress. How did you use these 2 hours that God has given you? So you multiply that by how many weeks you have in a year, and you calculate, and so you've been teaching this. I want to know, what did you do with these folks for this period of time? And when it gets up to 800, then you really start feeling like, ugh, if I didn't do what God, and so the question we discuss is, would God promote you or fire you? Because time is one of his most valuable commodities. He's given it to you. And so what did you do with it? So as a pastor, I have to look and say, boy, have I been productive?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question.
So,
yeah. Okay. What word would you have of encouragement or exhortation to young ministers in training? And, we've got folks who are going into all sorts of different kinds of ministry, academic ministry, counseling ministry, pastoral ministry here. But what word of exhortation or encouragement would you give to them?
I would say here's the thing I learned a long time ago is I need to stop studying to preach. Now, if I have nothing to preach, it's because I've not gained anything that week from my relationship with Christ. And so really, I spend time gaining from Christ. What do you want me to know? How do you want me to learn? How do you want me to develop? And then God really pours out from that whatever sermon and whatever comes out of what I'm preaching. So I would say that relationship with Christ just has to be. Don't get, and you hear this all the time, don't get so much into the duty of pastor. Let it be a reflection of who you are. The other thing I would say is, personally, I have found it of great value, if you're in a preaching ministry, to preach series. Preach a series. Here's one thing I do. What I do is I write a commentary of the book I'm going to preach or the series I'm going to preach. And we have what's called the pastoral preview. Sermon preview. And so a number of pastors sit down and we look over that information, and then we divide it off into sermon topics, and then I have the sermon topics there. And here's the reason why I say that is because, the Bible said I try to set aside at least 8 hours of study per week just for the sermon. And so if I already had a commentary, I've already done the research, I've already done the historical data, and the contextualization, and the parsing of the verbs, and the wrestling with the Hebrew, all of that stuff, then you put all that stuff together, and then when you get the actual sermon, I spend 8 hours getting that sermon prepared for presentation. Okay, so now I dedicate that time, and I don't compromise that for anybody. However, some weeks come about where if I hadn't done all that other stuff, then I would be giving them a Saturday night special. Because there's no way I could have been prepared. You have a death in the, one year we had 12 deaths, 12 funerals 1 year. That's a funeral a month. And you're dealing with grieving families, 12 grieving families. It doesn't sound like much, but, when you got, 12 grieving families amongst 800 people, then, it really gets to a point where it's a lot. And so, and sometimes you, the pastor, you, the leader, you got to give it. And so being ready for Sunday has to be something that has to be guarded. And the best way to do it is to have a systemic structure so that the cultural shifts won't change what your sermon is. That makes sense? And you won't be like Jeremiah Wright, on YouTube talking about Hillary and Obama. And I'm not saying what's good or bad about what he said, but I'm saying the political climate began to define the direction of his message. And so therefore, whatever God was going to do through the Holy Spirit was now taken over by a person that felt, I need to infuse me in the middle of this. In the middle of all of those funerals, I already had a series, and I didn't shake from the series. And it worked. I can probably say major times like 9/11, we had a series. Our series fit right in the middle of 9/11. I mean, everything was in place already. And so God has been faithful to that. And I would probably say that I have been able to be faithful to His Word because of that.
That's a good word. That's a good word. Okay, well, we'd like to take some time and hear questions from everybody right here. We've got a microphone that's roving, so it'd be good if you could speak in the microphone. That way, it'll be recorded for posterity.
Pastor Archie, I've been a part of Christ Community Church in Leawood. I was there for 4 years while I was in college, and then I'm going back there here in the spring to serve as part of their internship program. But I was just curious if you could speak a little bit about the relationship that Fellowship Christian Baptist has with Christ Community and how that urban-suburban church partnership has worked.
Okay. Christ Community is a sister church or a connected church. We almost can probably be called one church in two locations now because God has really kind of infused our energy into one another. I think that here's some key things, I think, because I'm asked that question a lot. The first thing is we didn't plan on having a suburban-urban church relationship. What we did, we recognized that our visions were common and that we could be more effective in fulfilling our vision as a team than we could be separately. So I will probably say the biggest mistake that a lot of urban and suburban churches make is that they try to get together for the sake of, they use race to determine the relationship. And that's always bad, even if it's cross-racial. And so I shouldn't use you being black to determine my relationship with you, or you being white to determine your relationship with you, or vice versa. So the first thing is we recognize as our vision. If we're going to impact the city, there are parts of the city that we are so unfamiliar with that we need a partner or an ally to be able to make that happen. The second thing is that we really wanted to see how we could begin to address the issues of differences without being afraid. Since the vision was the primary focus, then the discomforts didn't outweigh the vision. See, if I was just being with you because you're white, I'd give up on that after a while. I'd be like, you know what? I've listened to banjos too much, and I'm not driving out there no more. I'd be through with it. And you would say the bass guitar is killing me, and the drums are just too loud. You know what I'm saying? It would be, we wouldn't last. However, if the vision is a vision that God has given both churches, and they're combined together, then that means it's kind of like in a family. I got to tolerate my brother, and my sister had to tolerate us. Because it's family, and that's kind of how we've become. So we deal with the sticky wickets pretty openly. You say, boy, this was uncomfortable, and we just talk about it, and then work out ways to be able to see it happen. And over the years, we've seen such an integration that it makes sense. And I would say the third thing is the leadership has to be on board, and not just at the pastoral level. Our elders meet and talk. Our pastoral teams meet once a month, and we talk throughout the month when we're not meeting. And we do everything together. We make our plans together along with their plans. We sit down and say, okay, what are we planning on doing in the city of Kansas City? And so the benefits, like, for example, certain speakers, we sit down and talk about what speakers should come in, because we know that Christ Community can bring in speakers of a caliber that we wouldn't be able to connect with. And then we bring the urban pastors out to get what they could never afford to get in that particular situation. And then at the same time, there's an understanding of how to deal with the practical issues that face the city. Some of the things that we're doing, like, for example, I sit on the City Plan Commission. If issues take place that affect them, then I go in. And sometimes I'm using my blackness, because they don't want to say no to a minority sometimes. Okay? But they will say no to a majority. And so I can go in and use my influence, and if race is what they're using, and it's reverse racism against my brother, then I can go in. He got a black brother who can go in and deal with that issue. And then there are some issues. Some white folk don't want to give money to black churches, and so therefore I go get my white brother, go get the money, and then we work it out that way. But being open about those issues, I can't change that person individually unless they see our unity prevail over time. And so those are the three factors that I think are really important, and there are a lot of other things. I mean, we became very comfortably out of control pretty quickly. Meetings were taking place, and we were finding out at the Pastoral. You mean our ladies met with your ladies? We were finding out all this stuff was taking place under the current, and it wasn't even part of our plan. They would come tell us, this is what we're going to do, or this is what we did. So we're like, oh, well. But it was just, God took over and did what we probably would have tried to plan and messed up. And so
that's really cool.
Good.
First of all, thank you for being here with us.
Appreciate it. Welcome.
My question is, what are some ways, strategic ways, based off of what you all see in the Bible, that your church has dealt with violence and gangs in urban context?
Okay. What we just went over this morning, I think that it's clear where violence comes from. I mean, violence is not a result of skin color or anything like that. Violence is a result of a belief system. We've been conformed to certain ways. And then, so the first thing we need to really do is we need to address the ways in which people can be transformed. There's a number of things. First of all, I think you got to deal with the schools if you're going to deal with violence. I mean, if you skip the schools, then you skip where all the kids are. The other thing is we decided that, and we promote a church adopted school piece, and we're doing major things on that. The other thing that we decided to do is during the time when crime is the highest in the city, is during the summertime. There's about 5 weeks in the summertime when it's highest amongst especially urban youth. We have 20 churches in Kansas City, in the Kansas City area, where we do what's called a Freedom School. You guys familiar with Freedom School? The Freedom School is it's urban centered, and there's a grant that supports some of it. But what we decided to do was take a grant that was given to community centers and all that kind of stuff, and we made an alliance with the churches in the city. And so we get our goal is to get 2,000 kids off the streets during that 6 weeks period of time. And not only do we want to get them off the streets, but we want to employ 260 young urban college students during the summer to come in and serve as interns. And not only that, but we want to take some leaders who are leaders of youth and bring them in and give them some managerial leadership experience all during a 6 week period during the summertime when the crime is normally the highest. And so when the crime is highest now, all of the kids are in church. 2,000 kids are in church. We also have their parents that have to go through 6 weeks of training so you can work with them on issues of productive disciplines and things of that nature. It's free to the parents who are out there. We have 260 kids who are coming from college to learn how to give back to the children in their community. And then you have leaders that you're training during the same period of time. It's a strategic approach to say, we're going to offset the violence by offering an opportunity to affect their belief systems during that period of time. And the plus is all those kids go back to school and function better academically, even though our program is not centered around academics. That's kind of one of the ways. I think there are a lot of different ways to address it, but that's kind of one of the strategic ways that we've decided to do it. Matter of fact, Kansas City right now is the only city that has a church-based freedom school movement. Where we have 20 churches moving in that direction.
Bill Cosby and others have talked about the crisis of fatherlessness in the inner city. And you just talked some about that and how to address that. But what specifically can Christians and churches do to address that problem specifically? And how, in addition, can suburban churches come alongside inner city churches? Churches that don't have a real strong connection to the inner city, but that have a desire to help and train up young men to be leaders of family and home and culture. How can we do that?
Well, I would say that the first thing I think is that men have to be connected together, held accountable, and addressed at the church. In other words, you're not going to be a member of our church and neglect your children. It's just not going to happen. Okay, and so the first thing we're going to have to do is say, listen, if you neglect your children, we figured that is, the Bible has some words for you, and we can help you understand those. And so don't expect to be a member here if that's going to be the case. And so, yeah, we have guys that come in and have, one of the guys he's on our men's fellowship team now, he's working now, he has 5 kids. Think about Lamont. There's like 5 kids by 4 different group women. Hey, got to support him. He came in, he wasn't, he was selling drugs. And so we had to get him off drugs. We got him a job at UPS, and he got benefits now. He's working to make it work. And the pride that comes along with that. And so we connect those men together. There ought to be support for men to deal with their issues in that particular environment, especially in urban churches where urban churches are. I think that I think the other piece is that we have to be able to see and clearly paint a picture of what a successful man looks like. If the most successful looking people are rappers and pimps, then we got to have other models. Here's one of the things that suburban churches frown on often is a successful minister who has a decent house, a nice car, and all those different kind of things become something that they say, how can he live that way when the people in this community are living that way? Well, if he doesn't live that way, and I'm not talking about the extreme, I'm talking about decently. If he doesn't live that way, he is the most superior leader in the urban core. And so if the most superior leader in the urban core is driving what most people in the hood call a hoopty, a car that don't start half the time, and if he's wearing suits that look like they came from the thrift store, and if his house, is falling apart, then why would that energize young boys to begin to idolize that direction in life? When the rappers and the pimps are running around with bling bling, for white people that's shiny stuff hanging off them. With all of that stuff that's going on, and why would they idolize that? And so I think that white folks got to recognize that, yeah, we need to support, and I don't mean extreme. Don't take me for that. But I think that there ought to be a demonstration of what a decent living looks like from a person who is honest and pure and committed to Christ. And that's part of the problem. It's kind of, this welfare approach. Welfare says that if you progress, we're going to take the money away. And that's kind of the way white folks treat urban core. If you look like you're doing well, I'm going to take my support away. And so urban ministries have to promote their deficiency in order to be supported in any kind of way. They have to go in and say, these are how bad our kids are. This is how poor our people are. All this kind of stuff. And so therefore it perpetuates the problem. What I tell most of the people who I talk to who are suburban and they want to support, first of all, if you support me because I'm poor, then go away. I don't need you. If you support me because I have the potential to be successful, then I feel like you're leveraging God's goods. And that's really what you're looking for. So I would say that. I would probably say for white men to be effective in ministering with black men, and I do emphasize with, then I think you got to get in there and you got to understand and not be afraid to talk about white issues. We have white guys that talk about, yeah, I know that you guys suffer from some struggles too, but everybody expects me to do good because I'm white. And so, so the minority shift is taking away my job, and I'm going through all this kind of stuff because I'm white. Now, I understand the big picture that some of this affirmative action stuff is needed. However, as an individual who's supporting my family, I'm suffering a bit. And white folk don't want to talk about that. They just have an attitude about it, and then, that kind of stuff. So it has to be somewhere along the way, let's talk about all our dilemmas, and let's be in a relationship with one another, and then we can share the values that we can offer to each other's culture. Does that make sense? And so I would say have those things. And some of it can start off with simple stuff. Have a Super Bowl party, and have 5 questions where everybody has the answer. And then have a discussion at halftime about those answers. And then, no matter how tense the discussion gets, When the game started back up, all attention's gone. And you got answers to real questions. And then pull people back together. They have, what is this movie? Ben Stein's movie is coming out. Get a bunch of men together and say, let's go look at this and let's sit down and talk about it. You know, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to me? You know, during slavery days, during slavery, what is it? Black History Month. You know, get some folks together to talk about the slavery days. You know, get some folks together to sit down and talk about the issues as they address it, and so that people can honestly have a dialogue between the two, and if necessary, get a facilitator that will kind of coach the conversation so that people won't be afraid to talk. And then that way you begin to build relationships that become, as I said earlier about our relationship with Christ community, comfortably out of control. People will start calling each other on their own, saying, well, what did you mean by that exactly? And then conversations will go on outside of that. And so they'll say, well, let's come somewhere to meet. You know, it's interesting that racial relationships work in bars, in sports. I mean, we have bars in the hood where the bar used to be there, Mike's Tavern. They're still in the hood, and the whole hood has changed. People killing each other, drive-bys, all this stuff that's happening. And them white people will drive down to the hood and go to that tavern. I mean, like, and no black people. I'd be like, how is that still here? I mean, nobody I know ever goes there. And then all of a sudden you see these people walking down. No wonder they don't live around here. They will drive, and then the friends that met in the Cheers environment, they're friends for life. And we don't offer a Cheers environment in the church, when that's exactly the environment that Acts talks about. You know, and so I think we got to begin to do that so that God can do some things with men, so that we can have an exchange of value. One of the guys he's a lawyer, the church, he said he's a white guy. He said, I never hugged my son before until I was in this church for a while. And so there was a deficiency in his relationship with his kids that he didn't discover until he was in an urban environment. And so, you know, it works both ways. There's a value that can be offered both ways if we look at our assets rather than our hindrances and challenges.
Back to the issue.
Hurry up.
Back to the issue of fatherless boys. What would you say to a suburban church that wanted to come help your fatherless boys that had 200 of their own they were ignoring?
To a suburban church, I would sit down and say, here's what we need to do. Let's get all of the kids and all the fathers together. And not together in the same room, but let's get accountable. And so if let's suppose I had 200 and you had 200 boys. Then we put all them into some register. This is all the boys. So we got 400 boys, and then let's suppose we had 300 men. So we got 300 men, and we say, okay, now we have this whole thing going on. Here's the problem. The problem is they are a fish in water. They don't understand that they're wet yet. And so what you have to do is you have to let them know that they're wet. You got to get them out of that water for a minute. And they'll say, whoa, give me that back. And they'll begin to recognize that. So you got to begin to affect their belief system. And the way you affect their belief system is you start conversations that begin to awaken their perspective. Like if somebody told you that the shirt you had on, or the blouse that you had on was red all your life, your mom and them, everybody told you that, then it'd be hard for me to come up to you and say something that's going to make you think it's not. It's the color you think. But we can have some dialogue, some conversation, some interaction, and all of a sudden your belief system starts to shift. And you start thinking, maybe I'm not doing it right. Well, see, that's what happened to that guy. He said, you know what, I'm neglecting my child. I'm providing goods for him, I'm doing all that kind of stuff, but I'm not loving him. And but he learned that from some of the black folks who were around. So that conversation, with bringing all of them together, would begin to raise those issues. And I would probably say, well, if this is what love is, how are you doing it? Well, my kid's doing well. He's in college. Yeah, now I'm not asking you what his academic. I'm asking you, how are you doing this thing that God has told us to do? And we'll look at that. And when you start looking at what God says, it'll be some pros and cons on both sides. You'll look over here and say, these black folks are doing real good at this, even though they're neglecting financially and the other stuff. But over here, these white folks are doing very good at financially, but they're really neglecting over here. Then we can talk about ways that both groups can work.
You mentioned with regards to the low point in your ministry that resulted in a church discipline issue. In my short experience in church, it seems like very few churches are willing to initiate that process of church discipline, and if they do, it's maybe not done very well. Could you speak a little more in regards to practically how your church maybe goes through that process of church discipline, who handles it, and just a few practical things in regards to that?
In our church, we have an elder board. We're elder ruled. We have a women's leadership council because our elders, being all men, sometimes would make decisions, and then we come back after we put the policy in place, and the ladies was like, "Y'all crazy," and we realized, okay, so we got women's leadership council to kind of help us at times where we have issues that are going to address the whole church. But the elder board is kind of the ruling unit. We also have grievance councils, and so the grievance council becomes when you say, you go to a person first, and you take 2 or 3 witnesses, and then you take them before the church. Well, the first thing we want to do is whenever there's an issue comes up, we take it to an individual and say, you know what, that ain't right. We need to fix that. And if they say, I don't know how to fix it, then we disciple it. We give them a disciple. If they do something wrong and we think, okay, you need some help, then we'll give them 4 or 5 people that they can contact. And then with that issue, you don't contact anybody else but those 4 or 5 people. That way you have accountability and you don't have gossip. And if anybody have any questions, ask these 4 or 5 people. Don't go asking nobody else. Or else you'll be on discipline for gossip. And then after that, if you have, if the grievance council or the group that's working with them, if they're just not obeying them, then it goes to the elder board. And the elder board begins to take a position on what we need to do to address that particular issue. And if they don't do it then they're pulled away from membership until and they're given a clear picture of what they need to do for reconciliation in that particular case. And so we've always had discipline. I mean, at any number of times, people learn the discipline at the church. It happens more often than people see. It's just that some folks go through it very, very well, come out very successful. In this particular case, we had some folks that had been around long enough, and they felt like they had privilege. And so when they became disciplined, then they got hostile and wanted to attack me and my family and some other folks in ways, tried to spread rumors and all kind of stuff that was going on, false accusations and all that stuff. So we just followed the policy and had the elders go through the process, and at the end of the day, truth prevailed. So we have a young lady up here who's been raising her hand for quite a while. Hope I answered your question. Okay.
Pastor Chief, I really appreciate the message you sent today at the preaching. And I have a couple of questions in relation to some of the things you talked about. Mm-hmm. First is you talk about do not conform to the world any longer. And you actually come from a business background to a ministry. And I suppose there are things you will have to, you took a lot of gift with you and experience with you for the service to God, but I suppose you also had the experience of change yourself to be in this service, right? Mm-hmm. That's the one question. I just want to see if there's anything particular you want to share with us. And the other thing is talking about belief system. You mentioned how you were faithfully being the server in terms of share the words in the preaching, God's words in preaching. Mm-hmm. But from your preaching and your talk, it also showed very clearly that you pay a lot of attention to the counseling ministry part of the church too. Mm-hmm. And I think the introduction of you is you actually care about a person as a whole. Now, I guess I noticed some of the pastors and the future pastors here, some of us at least, do not necessarily feel counseling is as important a service as preaching. Okay. So what do you say to that belief system?
First of all, I would say that let me go back to the first question you asked. Really, what ended up happening is I found value in God's word as a leader, as a manager in the corporate community. And so I was really taking God's truth and practically putting it to work. And matter of fact, I wrote a lot of the policies based on Scripture that we implemented in the corporate environment because God was bringing success. And so really it was kind of the other way around. And so when I came into the business world, to the church community, I'd already spent a lot of time understanding how those things are applicable to leadership. And so that kind of helped me a lot. I didn't know how to be a leader other than on the streets. And, when I got into the corporate environment and I got promoted so quickly, I had 7 promotions in a very, very short period of time in a company that was Sprint Corporation. And when Sprint was first starting out, I was kind of one of those guys designing that. And so I got to meet with all of the movie stars. All the stuff. I worked in almost every facet of the company. And so that was there. So that answers that question. I think you integrate it if it meets God's approval. Because if you see it anywhere, it was God's idea first. I go with this notion, God has come up with all the best ideas. And so anything that I come up with, if it doesn't compare to His, it's probably a bad idea. I just don't know it yet. So I always go to Him. The second thing, with reference to counseling versus preaching, I think that if they don't go together, it's not discipleship. And so I think that in our process, our sermons are carrying the congregation along the way. And so there's not like right now our series is on, our theme for the year is becoming a seriously sanctified believer. So in every area, then, I want to be, when my sanctification, God has pulled me away or separated me for the cause of the gospel, and I want to be so serious about that it shows up in everything that I do. Well, our whole preaching series goes on that. Our focus of all the teaching goes on that. Our seminars, our couple stuff, everything kind of goes along with that same piece, so that whatever you're doing on a discipleship level is also a part of the preaching discussion that's taking place. It's just at a theological level, where I talk about the belief system, for example, at a theological level, then at a practical level, the teacher and everybody else is going to be applying that belief system issue. And so we'll have ways to deal with belief systems that we're trying to overcome throughout the whole course of the church. So counseling becomes a part of the outcome of what takes place. And I get that model from Acts. It's not anything I made up. In the book of Acts, they would preach a sermon, and then everybody would kind of pick it up. If you look at Nehemiah 8, he read from the book, and afterwards they all broke down into family groups and then went in and tried to figure out how do we apply this. And so the preaching, if it's disconnected from the counseling, then it's going to seem like two separate things. But it should never be disconnected. So everybody's growing toward the same way. We used to do 40 days during Lent. We take Lent 40 days to Easter. And so we did 40 days, and then at 40 days we did a devotional together, the whole congregation, and we fasted for 40 days, something that is managing your flesh. Like for me, it was every meat. I had to fast every meat except for fish. For 40 days. Can you imagine that? 40 days, black preacher, no chicken. That was like the worst thing, I was born in barbecue, and I couldn't get that. And so, for 40 days, you couldn't make any major decisions in 40 days. So you had to pray and connect with people and do different things for 40 days. You had to recommit yourself to church ministry. You had to say, I am not doing enough, so I need to adjust my schedule so that I can do more. And then the fourth thing was, accountability. Yeah, small group accountability. Yeah, you had to, and so you had to make connections. And so those 4 things, we made a shift. We all grew. Some people gave up TV for 40 days. Some people gave up different things for 40 days, and we all struggled together. We just came to church crying, oh boy, I ain't had my chicken, I ain't seen the TV. We went through for 40 days, and it connected us to each other in a special way. And then we had a celebration afterwards, and then we all gave testimonies and talked about all that kind of stuff. We said, that's a counseling strategy. People were working with each other, things that I was strong in, and I could call you up and say, listen, don't worry about that. I can work with you through that stuff. You know what I'm saying? All that stuff is taking place in the fiber, and you might have some counselors who specifically can help people who run into challenges along the way. But if the whole congregation is moving, there's no separation between preaching and counseling.
We've got to close, but we'll be back here on Thursday. Could you be around for 10, 15 minutes to answer a couple more questions, one-on-one maybe? Mm-hmm. But thank you all so much for coming, and let's give thanks to the Lord for Pastor Archie and coming to be with us.